The studio lights blazed hot, casting sharp white beams over the glossy black floors. The audience, a restless sea of clapping hands and eager eyes, buzzed with anticipation that it was supposed to be just another easy interview. A little laughter, a few jokes, a celebrity showing off a glamorous life, and then Keanu Reeves walked onto the stage. No designer suit. No entourage. No flashy jewelry. Just a simple black t-shirt, worn jeans, scuffed boots, the same quiet, steady walk he always had, the kind that didn't demand attention but somehow claimed every inch of the room anyway. The host, a man famous for sharp humor and sharper insults, welcomed him with a grin too wide to be genuine. They shook hands. Keanu sat down, relaxed, calm, leaning back slightly in his chair. The first few questions were easy, about upcoming projects, action scenes, a few scripted laughs from the audience, but then it shifted. The host leaned forward, smirking, and said into the mic, "So Keanu, you're one of the richest actors in Hollywood, and yet you still take the subway? Still live like a college student? I mean, come on, man. What's the deal? Can't afford a new pair of boots?" The crowd laughed, a sharp, uncomfortable ripple. Keanu smiled politely. Didn't flinch. Didn't react. The host, sensing blood, pushed harder. "I mean, you ever think about, acting rich? Maybe buy a mansion, a yacht, I don't know, at least some new jeans. You're making the rest of us look bad." More laughter, louder this time. Some people laughed easily, relieved it wasn't them on the spot. Others laughed because they thought they were supposed to, but a few faces in the crowd shifted, uncomfortable, questioning, because somewhere deep down, everyone could feel it. The man in the simple clothes didn't need to defend himself. The laughter wasn't landing where it was supposed to, and something was about to change. Keanu sat there, still smiling faintly, his eyes calm, as if he was seeing right through the noise. That he adjusted the microphone slightly with his fingertips, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried further than any of the host's jokes. Keanu leaned slightly forward, elbows resting loosely on his knees. The studio, still half laughing a second ago, shifted, the kind of shift you feel more than you see. A slow, sinking hush rolling across the crowd. He didn't smirk. He didn't glare. He just spoke, his voice soft but so sharp it sliced straight through the bright lights and fake smiles. "I wear what's comfortable," Keanu said simply. "I take the subway because it gets me where I need to go." The host chuckled awkwardly, trying to keep the joke alive. "Yeah, but come on, man, you could be riding in a limo. You could be living like a king." Keanu's smile faded, not into anger, but into something heavier. He looked at the host, really looked at him, and in that moment, it wasn't two celebrities chatting anymore. It was a man who had buried a sister. A man who had carried grief like a second skin. A man who had known loss deeper than most ever would, and it was a man who understood, more than anyone, that things could never fill the empty places in your soul. "I don't need a throne to know who I am," Keanu said, voice low and sure. "I don't need gold around my neck to remember what I value." He glanced toward the audience, a sea of faces, now wide-eyed and silent. "I've seen people with nothing who gave everything, and people with everything who had nothing worth giving." The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The laughter was gone now, only the truth remained. Keanu straightened a little. "You think the car I drive defines me, the boots I wear?" He paused. "You know what defines a man?" He held up a hand, counting slowly on his fingers. "How he treats people when he has nothing to gain, how he stands when no one's watching, how he carries himself through loss, and through loneliness." The words weren't spoken loudly, they didn't need to be, they hit like a hammer on stone, solid, final, undeniable. Someone in the audience clapped once, just once, but in the echo of that single sound, something broke wide open. More hands joined. A ripple, then a wave. Within seconds, the entire studio was on its feet, applauding, not the fame, not the fortune, but the quiet, unstoppable dignity of a man who had never needed a spotlight to shine. The host tried to laugh it off, muttering something about getting deep real fast, but the tide had already turned. The stage no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the man in the scuffed boots, in the simple black t-shirt, in the soul that needed no crown to prove its worth. And for the first time that night, under all the lights, with all the cameras rolling, Keanu Reeves smiled, not politely, not nervously, but the smile of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone, not anymore. When the cameras cut off, there was no mad rush for the doors, the usual noise, the Clatter of heels, the chatter of guests eager to post their selfies online never came. The audience sat frozen in their seats, the weight of what they had witnessed settling heavy on their shoulders. Some glanced around awkwardly, as if waking up from a long, cheap dream they were ashamed to admit they had enjoyed. Some clapped softly, almost to themselves. Others simply sat heads bowed, eyes burning, realizing how easy it was to laugh at the wrong person. And how rare it was to stand in the presence of someone who didn't need to shout to command the room. Backstage, the crew moved. Slower 2.no jokes.no cocky laughter about another good show. The sound guys, the makeup artists, the stagehands, hardened veterans of the industry simply nodded at each other in heavy silence, because deep down, they knew, something real had happened tonight, something more important than ratings, something more important than trends. The host, the man who had made a career out of making others squirm for laughs, stood alone in his dressing room. His reflection glaring back at him that he replayed the moment over and over in his mind, his cheap jokes, his smug tone, and Keanu's face calm, patient, devastating without lifting a single finger. The host sat down hard on the couch, dropping his face into his hands that he thought about all the people he had laughed at to fill the silence over the years, all the easy targets, all the fragile dreams he had chipped away at, thinking it was cleverness when it was just cowardice. Tonight, he had finally been forced to see it for what it was. And he hated himself for it. Meanwhile, out in the real world, the story was already catching fire. Clips of Keanu's quiet response exploded across the internet. Not memes, not jokes, truth. "This is what real class looks like," wrote one account. "In a world addicted to noise, he chose dignity," wrote another. Millions watched the clip, and for once, they didn't move on in 30 seconds, they replayed it, they thought about it, they sent it to their friends, to their families, to their children, because in Keanu's few simple sentences, they heard something they hadn't realized they were starving for: authenticity, humility, real strength. Keanu didn't tweet about it. He didn't post a victory selfie. Didn't bask in the praise. When the studio doors swung open, he slipped out alone, hands in his pockets, head bowed slightly against the evening wind. No cameras followed him. No bodyguards shielded him, just a man walking through a city that suddenly seemed a little quieter, a little less cruel because of something he hadn't done to impress, but something he had done simply because it was who he was. Later that night, at home in a small apartment far from Hollywood's Golden Hills, Keanu sat quietly by the window, drinking tea, watching the stars blink into existence above the skyline. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he just breathed, steady, calm, grateful, because he knew, fame was loud, but character was silent, and it lasted longer. In the end, it wasn't the jokes people remembered. It wasn't the suits or the stage lights or the viral hashtags. It was the man who sat in a worn black t-shirt, boots scuffed from real life, and showed a world drowning in noise what it meant to be still, and strong, and good, without ever needing to raise his voice, because sometimes, the loudest thing in the room, is the man who says the least. 2 days passed. The clip of Keanu's calm answer had circled the world 100 times over. Millions had watched, millions had commented, millions had changed, if only a little, but Keanu stayed silent. No interviews, no statements, no self-congratulation. Only one thing surprised everyone: he agreed to come back. When the show announced that Keanu Reeves would return for a follow-up appearance, the city buzzed like a live wire. Was he coming back to gloat, to throw back the humiliation the host had earned, to bask in the applause now waiting for him? No one knew. Everyone tuned in, and when Keanu stepped onto the stage again, the room was already different. The audience didn't just clap, they rose, all of them, standing ovation before he had even said a word, not because he was a star, because he was something rarer. A man who had reminded them of what a real star should be. The host looked different too. Gone was the smug grin, the rehearsed jokes. He stood awkwardly at his mark, waiting not as a king welcoming a guest, but as a student waiting for a teacher. Keanu walked calmly to his chair, sat down, and nodded politely. The room settled into a breathless, reverent silence. The cameras rolled. The host cleared his throat. "Keanu," he said, voice lower, smaller, "thank you for coming back." Keanu smiled, that quiet, almost imperceptible smile. "I figured we had a little more to talk about," he said simply. Soft laughter rippled, warm this time, real. The host nodded, swallowing hard. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not just for the jokes. For forgetting what matters." Another ripple of silence. "You reminded me," the host continued, that respect isn't about money. Or clothes. Or being flashy, that it's about being real. He paused, as if struggling to find words that didn't sound rehearsed. And I forgot that. I forgot that somewhere along the way. Keanu didn't rush to fill the space, that he let the moment breathe. Then he said, voice low and steady, we all forget sometimes. He looked out at the crowd, at hundreds of faces, waiting, wanting something deeper. But the important thing, Keanu said, is remembering who you want to be before the world told you who you should be. Silence, the kind of silence that feels like prayer, and then, in a move no one expected, the host did something that left the entire audience stunned. He pulled out a small check trembling slightly in his hand and said, I want to donate tonight's salary to a charity of your choice, Keanu. The crowd gasped, real money, real humility. A real step forward. Keanu blinked, touched not by the money, but by the shift, the choice to make something better, not just talk about it. He leaned forward, took the mic gently in his hand, and said, let's do something bigger. The host, confused, frowned. Keanu smiled. Let's match every donation from tonight's viewers too, he said. If you want to prove that what you wear doesn't define you, show me with what you give. The audience erupted, this time not in laughter, but in thunderous, soul-deep applause. Messages flooded in within seconds, donations poured like a tidal wave. By the time the show ended, they had raised enough to build new shelters, fund scholarships, feed families, enough to change lives, all because one man refused to play by the old rules, all because one man answered cruelty not with anger, but with example. Later, off camera, in the quiet of the nearly empty studio, the host found Keanu again. He hesitated, then reached out a hand. Keanu took it strong, steady, and in that simple handshake, something unseen but very real passed between them. A debt paid. A lesson learned. A better way chosen. And Keanu, as always, didn't stay for the cameras. He slipped out through the back door, into the cool night, where no one cheered, where no one chased him, just the stars above and the quiet satisfaction that sometimes the smallest acts set off the biggest revolutions, because sometimes a man doesn't change the world by fighting, that he changes it by refusing to become like it. The night after the second interview, the world didn't just react, it moved. The hashtag #BeLikeKeanu trended for days, but it wasn't just another trend, another 15 minutes of fame. Something deeper stirred, something that couldn't be captured by likes or shares alone. In a small town in Ohio, a teenager who had been bullied for wearing thrift store clothes stood up in the school cafeteria, lifted his chin, and said, you don't get to decide my worth. And the cafeteria, the same one that had laughed at him for a year, fell silent, because they had seen Keanu stand, and they realized that dignity didn't wear a brand name. In a rundown neighborhood in Manila, a man who had spent his life sweeping streets stopped hiding from the cameras. He stood proudly for a photo, broom in hand, because he knew now there was no shame in honest work. Not when the whole world had seen that the richest man on the stage had the simplest soul. In a hospital ward in London, a young nurse who had been mocked for not dreaming big enough changed her mind about quitting. She wiped her tears, rolled up her sleeves, and whispered to herself, kindness is strength. Because she had heard it without anyone needing to say it, because Keanu had shown it. Across continents, small revolutions broke out in the quietest ways. People paid for strangers' meals and didn't post about it. Students stood up when teachers were mocked. Workers chose compassion over cruelty. Fathers hugged their sons a little tighter. Daughters looked at their mothers and smiled without needing a reason. Because when real dignity is set loose into the world, it doesn't roar. It echoes, softly, surely, changing one heart at a time. And what about Keanu? He didn't ride the wave he had created. He didn't do interviews. Didn't sell t-shirts. Didn't try to brand the moment. He simply lived, every day, the same way he always had, quietly, kindly, relentlessly true to himself. One evening, about a month later, a young girl waiting at a subway station spotted him. No cameras. No entourage, just Keanu, backpack slung over his shoulder, waiting like everyone else. She hesitated, shy, then gathered her courage and walked up to him, clutching a small, crumpled piece of paper. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, voice trembling. Keanu knelt slightly, meeting her eyes, smiling that gentle, tired smile. For what? He asked softly. For reminding us, she said, that it's okay to be simple. To be real. Keanu nodded once, deeply, like a promise, and without needing to say anything more, he slipped the paper into his pocket, gave her a tiny wave and boarded the train. The girl watched the doors close behind him, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small, she felt infinite. Because she understood, it's not how loudly you walk through the world that matters. It's how deeply you touch it when you do, and one man with worn boots, a soft voice, and an unbreakable soul had just reminded the world how to be better, without ever needing to shout. Time, indifferent and relentless, marched on. News cycles moved to the next scandal. Trends shifted like sand. New faces exploded across screens, louder, flashier, more desperate for attention. The world churned forward, hungry for the next spectacle, but deep beneath all that noise, something quiet refused to be swept away. It had been planted, carefully, silently, in the hearts of those who had watched a man sit calmly under the brightest lights, refusing to be moved by mockery or fame. A seed, and that seed had begun to grow. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, no global announcement. It happened slowly, invisibly, like the tide creeping higher while no one was watching. In a suburban school in Kansas, a boy who had always been teased for his thrift store clothes stood up when another student became a target. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He just moved and stood beside the boy being mocked. Silent solidarity. And the laughter stopped. In a bustling cafe in Mumbai, a waitress who had been treated poorly for years by entitled customers decided to leave a free coffee for an old man who always sat in the corner, unnoticed. She didn't post about it. She just did it because it felt right. In Berlin, a tired office worker gave his seat on the subway to a janitor carrying heavy bags. No cameras. No applause. Just a small moment of grace, and when asked why, if anyone ever asked, the answers were always the same, though phrased differently in 100 languages. It just felt right. It's what a good man would do. I saw someone once, and it stuck with me. The ripples grew. In shelters, in schools, in cramped hospital hallways, in forgotten towns and glittering cities, people made choices. Not grand, sweeping gestures. Simple ones, choosing dignity over cruelty. Choosing patience over pride. Choosing kindness over comfort, because when someone like Keanu Reeves reminded the world what true strength looked like, not with rage, not with ego, but with unshakable quiet, it became impossible to forget. Keanu himself remained unchanged. No new PR campaign. No new movie deal capitalizing on his moment. No best-selling book of wisdom. He simply lived, each day, ordinary and sacred in its ordinariness, early mornings, simple breakfasts, long walks without bodyguards. He read old novels. He practiced chords on his worn-out guitar. He visited bookstores, chatted with clerks, paid for strangers' coffees without ever giving his name. At night, he would sit by his window, the city stretching far and restless beneath him, the stars stubbornly blinking overhead, and he would breathe, quietly, carrying no burden except the quiet knowledge that he had planted something good and let it live without trying to control it. One evening, nearly a year after that unforgettable interview, Keanu received a letter. It wasn't sent by an agent or a corporation. It was handwritten, slightly crooked, the ink smudged where someone's hand had trembled. It read, "Dear Mr. Reeves, I was going to end my life last year. I thought the world didn't need people like me, invisible, broken, small. Then I saw you. I saw you listen, even when mocked. I saw you stand your ground without lifting your voice. I saw you exist, fully and quietly, in a way that made me believe there might still be room in this world for someone like me too. I'm still here, thank you." There was no signature. Keanu folded the letter carefully, tucked it into a small, worn leather journal he kept on his nightstand, and said nothing to anyone about it. Some victories are too sacred to announce. The stories kept coming, though Keanu never chased them. A janitor in Sydney who was promoted after his quiet dedication was finally recognized. A teenage girl in Tokyo who, instead of mocking a classmate for stuttering, offered to walk with him to school every morning. A father in Cape Town who taught his sons that being strong had nothing to do with fists, and everything to do with kindness. Each small act stitched another invisible thread into a tapestry far greater than any one man, and though few ever traced it back directly to him, the truth lived in the spaces between the acts, the breaths between choices. They remembered the man who had worn his scars without armor. The man who had shown them that courage didn't have to roar. The man who proved that dignity, real dignity, was louder than any shout and more enduring than any flash. Sometimes, when Keanu rode the subway home late at night, he saw hints of it, a teenager giving up his seat for a grandmother. A woman pausing to help a stranger pick up dropped groceries. A tired businessman leaning down to pet a stray dog in the rain. And Keanu would smile to himself, small and private, and know, the quiet had won. Years later, when asked during a rare interview about his legacy, Keanu only chuckled softly and said, "I hope I reminded people that being good is still enough." And he left it at that. No need for more, because real greatness doesn't demand the last word. It simply echoes endlessly, invisibly in every small kindness left in its wake, and somewhere, in the smallest acts of courage, kindness, and dignity across the world, Keanu Reeves never stopped speaking, because sometimes the truest revolution is the one no one notices until they find themselves living inside it.